June 1943. The sound of the code. The rhythm of the Enigma was the rhythm of my heart. Dots, dashes, silence. That sound filled the cramped cabin of the Kriegsmarine vessel where I spent my days and nights. The hum of the generator mixed with the pulse of the telegraph, creating a song only we operators understood. Each transmission was sacred. Each click of the keys meant another command sent to the Atlantic, to the submarines that hunted in the dark. We believed our words were untouchable, locked behind layers of genius only German minds could conceive. I was proud, foolishly proud. Hitler trusted the machine, and we trusted him. I can still see it before me, the polished metal, the strange beauty of its symmetry, the glow of the lampboard flickering as the coded letters came alive. The officers spoke of Enigma as if it were divine, a creation that no human could ever outwit. When I touched it, I felt like part of something greater than a man. It made us feel invincible. Our faith in those clicking rotors was our religion. But war has a way of twisting faith into delusion. The Atlantic was vast, yet we ruled it through signals. From this small room, lined with cables and steel, we reached submarines scattered across endless waves. My hands translated human will into pulses of electricity. A convoy's coordinates. An order to dive. A command to strike. I never saw the faces of the men my signals guided, only the results that returned through new messages. Convoy destroyed. Minimal losses. Each line of text felt like proof of our superiority. The truth is, I loved the machine more than the sea. It gave me control in a world drowning in chaos. Outside, storms tore through the channel. Inside, I sat surrounded by logic, order, and precision. It was clean, predictable, safe. And yet, even then, I could feel something darker under the hum of the wires, something fragile, like the faint buzz before a short circuit. At night, when the ship rocked under the moonlight, I listened to the soft tapping of the telegraph from distant vessels. The ether was alive with voices, German, Italian, sometimes faint signals we couldn't identify. We filtered them, logged them, encrypted and decrypted them with absolute confidence. I remember thinking, no one can read this but us. It was comforting and deadly. Our commander would pass by occasionally, his boots echoing against the metal floor. Remember, he'd say, the English may have ships, but we have intellect. His words fed our arrogance. We believed our codes were unbreakable, our logic beyond the reach of any foreign hand. The idea that someone, somewhere, might be listening, truly listening, never crossed our minds. There was a superstition among us operators. If you made a mistake while typing the code, fate would punish you. A sinking, a storm, a death. I made no mistakes. Not one. I thought that made me safe. That night, I transmitted an urgent message, a set of coordinates for a U-boat patrol near the Bay of Biscay. The pattern of dots and dashes filled the cabin, the sound sharp, rhythmic, beautiful. I watched the final light flicker green, meaning the signal was sent. I didn't know that, somewhere across the sea, a British antenna had caught my pulse. I didn't know that, at that very moment, a mind far sharper than ours was already untangling what we believed could never be understood. I closed the transmission log, proud of another flawless code. The machine purred beside me like a loyal beast. Above deck, the crew sang a marching song. The night smelled of oil and salt. Everything felt secure, orderly. Yet, deep down, in the whisper between the static, I heard something else. A different rhythm. A faint echo. As if the code itself had started to answer back. July 1943. Voices in the ether. The air aboard our vessel was thick, with oil, sweat, and unease. The Kriegsmarine called us the nerve of the Atlantic, yet all I felt was tension running through cables and veins alike. The radio room never slept. Even when the engines quieted, the air vibrated with invisible words. Static, pulses, frequencies, the ocean speaking in tongues only machines could understand. I was fluent in that language. Or at least, I believed I was. Each morning began the same, decoding transmissions from command, encrypting replies, logging every blip of energy across the waves. The Enigma stood at the center of it all, polished, immaculate, untouchable. The officers treated it like an altar. Some even saluted it before turning the first rotor. And why wouldn't they? It had given us everything, victories, ambushes, power. Our intelligence network stretched from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. Every British convoy we intercepted felt like proof that our science, our discipline, was unmatched. But war was changing. I didn't notice it at first. No one did. A certain pattern began to repeat in the intercepted transmissions. Faint, almost ghostly signals, like whispers bleeding through the ether. They didn't belong to any of our frequencies. At times, it felt as if another operator were out there, listening in, breathing through the static. I'd hear short bursts that ended too abruptly, as if cut off the moment I tuned in. Coincidence, they said. But I had lived long enough with machines to know the difference between noise and intent. The sea around us was restless that month. Reports came in from the west. U-boats struck with uncanny precision. One hit after another, each closer to home. The officers blamed Allied aircraft, radar, even bad luck. The British are desperate, they said. They throw everything they have into the ocean. But I began to wonder, how desperate can a man be when he always knows exactly where to strike? One night, during a storm, we picked up a fragment of an English transmission. It was faint, distant, but clear enough to feel human. The voice was calm, too calm for war. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't random. It was measured, deliberate, as if mocking our codes. I remember staring at the receiver long after it went silent, feeling a strange chill crawl up my spine. For the first time, I thought, what if they can hear us too? That question never left me. I began to notice small details, a hesitation in the officers' voices, the growing frequency of emergency orders from Berlin, the quiet panic behind their confident smiles. Ships that were supposed to rendezvous never arrived. Convoys we were certain to ambush simply vanished, rerouted as if they knew our plans in advance. The pride that once filled the radio room turned into paranoia. The laughter faded. Every operator grew suspicious of the next. We triple-checked settings, burned old logs, tightened security, but the attacks kept coming. It was as if the ocean itself had turned against us, as if the waves whispered our secrets straight into British ears. One evening, I walked out onto the deck. The wind cut through my uniform, carrying the smell of salt and fuel. The sea was black and endless. I looked toward the horizon and thought of the voices drifting between our worlds, unseen, relentless, patient. The ether that had once been our ally now felt like an open wound. I returned to the radio room and sat before the Enigma, my fingers hovering over its keys. The machine looked the same, but something inside me had shifted. The faith I'd carried like armor was cracking. I realized then that war wasn't just fought with bullets and torpedoes. It was fought in silence, in frequencies, in the space between signals, a war of minds. And in that war, I feared we were already losing. August 1943, the pride of the machine. The Enigma gleamed under the dim red light of the radio cabin, its metal curves catching every flicker of the bulb as if it were breathing. I remember running my fingers across its keys, feeling the cold precision of German engineering, flawless, perfect, divine. To us, it was more than a machine. It was our guardian, our proof that intellect could control chaos. Every man aboard the vessel trusted it as he trusted his own weapon. Some even more so. I used to think the Enigma was alive. When the rotors turned, I swore I could hear it whisper, a secret language of victory, of dominance, of order in a world drowning in war. The officers treated it like an idol. "This," one of them said, pointing at it with pride, "is the mind of the Reich." I believed him. We all did. No one questioned, no one doubted. Questioning meant weakness, and weakness had no place in the fleet. I would sit for hours beside that mechanical heart, listening to its rhythm, watching the coded letters light up like stars. I remember thinking, as long as this machine exists, we cannot be defeated. That illusion kept us alive, or at least, it made dying seem worthwhile. The messages came fast that month. Berlin demanded constant updates, convoy movements, U-boat positions, reports from the occupied ports in France. I typed for hours, my hands moving faster than thought, my ears tuned to the faint clicks that confirmed each letter's encryption. Outside, the world roared, bombs over Brest, the growl of Allied aircraft somewhere beyond the fog, but in that room, it was all precision and certainty. We believed the Enigma gave us control over the sea. We didn't realize it had already started to betray us. It began subtly. Orders would arrive late, or altered. Submarines vanished without a trace. Command would blame weather interference, but the sea was calm. Then our convoys, supposedly secure under coded instructions, began to fall one after another. Destroyers ambushed in the dark. Cargo ships torpedoed before they even reached the channel. It was as if the enemy knew our routes, our timetables, our intentions, everything. Still, the faith remained. "Impossible," said the officers. "The Enigma cannot be broken." Those words became a mantra, repeated to drown out the truth. And I, too, clung to it, not out of belief, but out of fear. Because if Enigma could fail, then what else was left to protect us? Late one night, I was recalibrating the rotors when I caught my reflection in the polished metal of the machine. My face looked older, thinner, hollowed out by sleepless nights. I wondered what the British operators looked like at that same moment, those invisible adversaries on the other side of the ether. Were they also staring into machines, listening to ghosts in the static, fighting the same war of silence? The next morning, I transmitted a report to command. Another convoy lost, another coded signal unanswered. The captain's temper exploded, a chair thrown, curses swallowed by the hum of the generator. But even in his rage, I saw something that terrified me more than his shouting. I saw doubt. For the first time, he didn't look at the Enigma as a weapon. He looked at it as if it might be lying to him. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cabin smelled of metal and despair. I sat alone beside the machine, tracing the engraved eagle on its frame. The same symbol stamped on our uniforms, our helmets, our souls. The emblem of superiority. But superiority means nothing when your enemy can read your mind. I stared at the Enigma, and for the first time, it no longer seemed powerful. It seemed fragile, like a locked door whose key was already in someone else's hand. September 1943. Echoes of London. It began with whispers, distant, impossible whispers of precision strikes that no one could explain. The first report came from the North Atlantic, a supply convoy obliterated before it even changed course. Then another from the Bay of Biscay, 3 U-boats ambushed within hours, all in positions known only to the highest command. Coincidence, they said. The English are guessing. But deep inside we all felt it. Guessing wasn't that accurate. From my post in the communications room, I watched patterns emerge like wounds reopening across the map. Every set of coordinates we transmitted seemed to summon death. The British attacked where they shouldn't have known to look. They struck with a precision that felt inhuman, as though they could see through the static, through the code, straight into our plans. The officers tried to keep morale alive. "Espionage," one shouted. "A spy among the French ports." But I'd seen enough transmissions to know better. The leaks were not from men. They were from within the machine itself. That month, the sea became a graveyard. The cold channel wind carried stories from survivors, if you could call them that. Men rescued from sinking submarines spoke of destroyers waiting for them, depth charges dropping before they even surfaced. "They knew we were there," one man muttered, trembling, his eyes hollow. "They knew before we did." He was sent away the next morning, shipped back to the mainland. No one saw him again. The tension spread like infection. Every operator began questioning the silence between transmissions. Each pause, each flicker of interference could be them, the British, listening, decoding, hunting. I tried to drown that thought in routine, typing endless strings of encrypted letters, aligning the rotors with mechanical precision. But I couldn't ignore what I felt every time the machine clicked, a faint echo, a reflection, as though something out there was responding in kind. Then came the night that confirmed my fears. We were stationed near the coast of Normandy when the alarms went off. Anti-aircraft guns roared above deck, the ship shuddered, and through the porthole I saw flashes in the sky, distant but deliberate, like lightning that obeyed commands. Within minutes, we were under bombardment. The precision of it was monstrous. Bombs fell exactly on our supply caches, our fuel reserves, our communication towers. It wasn't random destruction, it was knowledge. I ran to the radio cabin, heart hammering, the Enigma still glowing faintly in the red light. Static filled the receiver, chaos, cries for help, orders overlapping, dying mid-sentence. I tried to reach command, but the signal was drowned in interference. For the first time, I felt powerless before the very device that had once made me feel invincible. When the attack finally ceased, the horizon burned red. The harbor of Le Havre lay in ruins, and the smell of oil and smoke covered the sea. I looked around and saw faces lit by fire, not by faith. No one spoke. Even the captain's voice trembled when he ordered radio silence. That night, alone in the cabin, I replayed the transmission logs. The times, the routes, the signals, all precise, all correct. We had done nothing wrong. And yet, the enemy struck as if guided by our own hands. I stared at the Enigma and whispered, "What have you told them?" For the first time since the war began, I wished I didn't know how to listen. Because somewhere across the ether, in the ruins of London perhaps, there were ears. Unseen, patient, brilliant, that had turned our secrets into weapons. And I could hear them now. In the faint hum of the wires. In the rhythm of the machine that once promised salvation. London was speaking back. October 1943. The silence of a submarine. The news came in the middle of the night, a single coded line from Berlin that froze every man in the radio cabin. U-559 lost contact. Investigation underway. There was no panic in the message, no emotion, just the mechanical phrasing of bureaucracy. But I knew. We all knew. When a U-boat lost contact, it meant death. The U-559 was a legend among the fleet, one of our most reliable hunters. I had transmitted its orders myself only days before, patrol coordinates, coded rendezvous points, even supply updates. Every signal went through the Enigma. Every word encrypted beyond comprehension. Or so we thought. 2 days later, rumors began to seep through the channels. The British had taken something, not just sunk the U-boat, but boarded it. I remember the moment vividly. We were anchored off Brest when the operator beside me whispered the words that would change everything. They captured the codebooks. I laughed at first. It was absurd. No one could board a U-boat. It would scuttle before surrender. That was our rule, our oath. And yet, the rumor persisted. The British destroyer HMS Petard, they said, had forced the U-559 to the surface. Their men had jumped into the water, climbed aboard as it sank, and seized whatever they could from inside: papers, rotors, manuals. A suicide mission for information. A madness that worked. The following morning, the order came: radio silence. The command room was suffocating. No one spoke. The officers' faces were pale, and for the first time, their arrogance cracked. They didn't explain why we had to go silent. They didn't need to. The message was clear. The enemy had heard us. For the next 3 days, I sat beside a dead machine. No transmissions. No signals. Only the hum of the generator and the groan of the sea. The Enigma stood idle, its lamps dark, its keys untouched. Without it, the room felt hollow, stripped of its purpose, its godhood. The silence was unbearable. At night, I could hear the distant thunder of Allied bombers, rolling like an approaching storm. Each explosion on the horizon felt personal, as if they were answering questions we hadn't asked aloud. I lay awake thinking of the British sailors who had drowned with the U-559, clutching our secrets in their frozen hands. Brave fools, risking everything for a handful of pages. Pages that might already be reshaping the entire war. By the 4th day, the silence had become more frightening than any battle. We were ghosts, armed, trained, but voiceless. I began to understand the truth I had refused to see. The War of the Atlantic was not being lost at sea. It was being lost in rooms like mine, in frequencies, in the unseen corridors of the mind. When the order finally came to resume transmissions, I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the keys, trembling. For the first time, the act of typing a message felt like betrayal, as if every click of the Enigma were a confession sent straight to London. The machine clicked and whirred as it always had, beautiful and merciless. But the sound had changed. It no longer felt like the heartbeat of victory. It sounded like the ticking of a clock counting down to our end. That night, as the ship drifted under a clouded sky, I sat alone beside the silent radio and listened to the sea. In the faint hiss of the static, I imagined I could still hear them, the echoes of the men who had died aboard the U-559, and the voices of those who now held what they had died to protect. The British had reached into the abyss and pulled out our soul. And now, the ocean itself seemed to whisper it back to us, "Your secrets are no longer yours." November 1943, the lie of command. They gathered us in a cramped, airless room in the port of Brest, a dozen operators, our uniforms still smelling of sea and oil. The doors were shut, the windows sealed. An officer I didn't recognize stood before us, his voice cold and metallic as he read from a prepared statement. "The British have obtained materials from the U-559, he began, his tone steady, rehearsed. "However, there is no cause for alarm. The documents were destroyed before they could be understood. The Enigma remains secure." He paused, scanning the room. No one moved. We sat rigid, the weight of his words pressing into the silence. "The Führer himself," he continued, "has confirmed the machine's integrity. The enemy gains nothing. Do not spread rumors. Do not question the system. The Reich's strength lies in discipline and in faith." Faith. That word stung more than any threat. I looked around the room, at men who had once believed as I had. Their faces were pale, their eyes tired, their hands restless. None of us believed him, not really. The officer's lips spoke conviction, but his eyes betrayed fear. Afterward, we were ordered back to duty as if nothing had happened. New frequencies, new ciphers, new keys, all meant to reassure us that control had been restored. But the more we encrypted, the more hollow it felt. I could see it in the others, the same unease, the same flicker of doubt behind every transmission. That night, I watched as a fellow operator, Muller, a man who had served since the early days of the war, was taken away by the Gestapo. They said he had spoken carelessly about the Enigma during a night at the barracks. I saw him dragged out in silence, his boots scraping against the floor, his face gray with terror. We never saw him again. From that moment, no one spoke freely. Even whispers could be fatal. We transmitted the Reich's messages with perfect precision, but inside, we were breaking, one code at a time. Every word I sent now felt poisoned. Every order I relayed felt like a lie. I realized that our true enemy was no longer across the sea. It was here, in the silence that ruled us, in the fear that kept us obedient. The machine still worked, the lights still flickered, but I could no longer hear the music in its rhythm. The next morning, a new order arrived from Berlin, stamped with urgency: maintain confidence in the system. Trust no one. Operate without hesitation. We were soldiers of the Signal Corps, once proud, now puppets of a delusion. I returned to my station, hands trembling, and placed them on the Enigma's keys. The machine hummed softly, waiting. It was a god still worshipped, even as its priests had lost their faith. For the first time, I prayed, not for victory, but for truth. December 1943, the storm over the Atlantic. The Atlantic had changed. It no longer smelled of salt and freedom, it smelled of smoke and death. The once proud wolf packs, the U-boats that had ruled those waters, were being hunted like prey. Every week brought new losses. Submarines disappeared without warning, entire crews swallowed by the cold black deep. We still transmitted their orders, each one encrypted through the Enigma. We still believed, or tried to. But the enemy knew, somehow, impossibly, every move before it happened. Convoys we were meant to ambush arrived with destroyers already waiting. Torpedo bays opened to silence. Sonar pings echoed through the hulls like funeral bells. I sat in the radio room, surrounded by cables and fear. The reports came in faster than we could record them. U-boat destroyed. No survivors. Escort sunk off Norway. Convoy lost contact. The ocean was bleeding, and we were the ones who had cut the vein. The captain's voice grew sharper each day. He shouted orders with the fury of a man trying to command fate itself. "Send the coordinates again," he'd bark. "They can't be reading us. It's impossible." But the impossible had already become routine. Each transmission felt like another death sentence, another breadcrumb for the British to follow. I began to hate the machine. Its rhythmic clicks no longer sounded like logic or strength. They sounded like laughter. Every letter I typed seemed to whisper mockery. They're listening. They're watching. They know. One night, during a heavy storm, We received a distress call from U-333, short, panicked bursts of Morse before silence. The coordinates were clear, somewhere near the Azores. The captain ordered us to relay the message to Berlin, but before I could finish transmitting, an explosion echoed through the ether. The signal cut off mid-sentence. I froze. The British destroyers had been waiting, again. The captain didn't speak for a long time. He just stared out into the dark sea, rain streaking across the glass. "They shouldn't have known," he finally muttered. "No one should have known." That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the storm outside blended with the crackle of the radio, an endless noise that gnawed at my mind. I kept thinking of the men inside those submarines, trapped in the dark, believing the codes would save them. Believing the Enigma was their armor. But the armor was paper. And the enemy had learned to read. Each dawn brought fewer voices on the radio, fewer signals from the depths. The ocean was going quiet, not with peace, but extinction. And I knew, as I pressed my hands against the cold metal of the console, that our war was no longer one of conquest. It was a slow drowning, one code, one lie, one life at a time. January 1944. The guilt of the operator. By the start of the new year, I no longer felt like a soldier. I felt like a ghost trapped in the hum of a dying empire. The Enigma still sat before me, loyal, flawless, deceitful. Every morning, I typed sequences of letters I no longer believed would protect anyone. Each message felt heavier than the last, as if the machine itself were feeding on our delusion. I began to imagine the faces of the men who would die because of what I sent. Somewhere beneath the Atlantic, they waited for my signal. Men who trusted me, men who had no idea their doom might already be written in the very code I transmitted. It haunted me. When I pressed a key, I felt their hands reaching out from the dark, their lungs filling with salt water, their final thoughts wrapped in encryption. Sleep became impossible. I sat awake through the nights, listening to the faint hiss of the ether. Every transmission from Berlin now carried the same message: continue operations. No breaches confirmed. Lies, all of it. We were bleeding, drowning, and still, the Reich demanded silence. One night, as I prepared to send another message to a U-boat near the Bay of Biscay, my hand stopped midair. For a heartbeat, I thought about not transmitting, about cutting the power, claiming a fault in the line. But fear is stronger than guilt. And in the Reich, hesitation was treason. I sent the message. 2 hours later, we received the report. U-412 lost contact. Presumed destroyed. I stared at the paper, the letters blurring through tears I didn't remember allowing. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that I was only following orders. But deep down, I knew the truth. The British weren't hunting blindly, they were following our every word. And I was the one giving them the map. That night, I sat in the dark radio room, staring at the Enigma until dawn. Its polished surface reflected my face, pale, hollow, unrecognizable. For the first time, I whispered aloud, "I am killing them." The machine, as always, answered with silence. February 1944. The invisible enemy. Rumors had begun to spread, whispers among officers and radio men. A place in England, they said, hidden somewhere in the countryside. A fortress not of steel, but of intellect. Bletchley Park, someone called it. A base where the British had gathered their brightest minds, mathematicians, linguists, scientists, to study us. I didn't believe it at first. The idea sounded fantastical, almost childish. War was fought by men with guns, not pens. Machines did not think, only men did. And yet, each month, the pattern of our losses grew too precise to deny. Someone, somewhere, was understanding us, line by line, key by key. They said this Bletchley had a machine of its own. One that could think. I laughed when I heard it. But the laughter died quickly. Because if such a thing existed, it explained everything, every ambush, every disappearance, every silence. It meant our God, the Enigma, was no longer divine. It had been outwitted by human minds, by freedom itself. The British didn't have to break our morale with bombs. They broke it with logic. And logic, unlike steel, could not be repaired. From then on, every time I sat at the console, I imagined those unseen enemies across the sea, calm, relentless, decoding our pride. They didn't need to shout, or march, or salute. They simply listened. They listened, and they learned. One night, a strange transmission came through the ether, faint, fragmented, but deliberate. It was in English, slow and rhythmic, as if meant to be heard. I caught a few words through the static. "We are listening." My blood turned to ice. Whether it was a trick of interference or something more, I never knew. But after that, I stopped seeing the enemy as faceless. They had become something else entirely, invisible, omnipresent, breathing through every signal I sent. The ocean had its storms. We had Bletchley Park. And there was no shelter left. March 1944, orders from Berlin. Berlin's answer to our fear came as it always did, with arrogance. A new order arrived, stamped with the Reich Eagle, implementation of the M4 system. A new Enigma, they said, more powerful, more complex, with an extra rotor that would make it mathematically unbreakable. The officers spoke of it as salvation, as if 4 rotors could rebuild what 3 had destroyed. We gathered around the new machine like worshippers around a new idol. The officers lectured about renewed security, about technological supremacy. I nodded along, but inside, I felt only dread. It was the same faith all over again, a fresh coat of paint over a rotting structure. The first night we used it, the cabin was filled with a tense, hopeful silence. I spun the rotors carefully, entering the new keys as instructed. The lights flickered, the letters danced, the same rhythm, the same promise. For a moment, I almost believed. But then, hours later, we received the first report from the Atlantic, another U-boat destroyed. Another secure transmission that led to a grave. The captain slammed his fist against the console. "They can't possibly have cracked it already," he shouted. His voice echoed off the steel walls. No one answered. We didn't need to. I realized then that we had learned nothing. We changed the machines, not the minds. We built stronger locks, but left the same men holding the same keys, and believing the same lies. That night, I stood on deck and looked toward the horizon. The sky over the channel glowed faintly red with distant fire. Somewhere beyond that line, across the darkness, I imagined the British operators working quietly, calmly, feeding our new unbreakable messages into their machines. Berlin still believed we were ahead. But I knew better. We weren't leading anymore. We were being followed, every step, every signal, every word. And with every new code I sent, I could almost hear them, the invisible minds across the sea, waiting patiently, listening as our arrogance spelled out our own destruction. April 1944. Lights on the horizon. It happened just before dawn. I was on duty, half awake beside the Enigma, when the first reports came through, enemy bombers approaching Brest. At first, I dismissed it. False alarms were common. But then the sky outside turned white. The roar came seconds later, shaking the steel walls and raining dust from the ceiling. The entire port was burning. We stumbled to the deck. Above us, the horizon glowed with hundreds of lights, British bombers in perfect formation, dropping death with surgical precision. The anti-aircraft guns fired wildly, their tracers arcing like sparks from a dying fire. Every explosion struck exactly where it hurt most: fuel depots, communications posts, radio towers. Not a single bomb missed its mark. "They know," the captain whispered beside me. "They know everything." I wanted to deny it, to cling to the idea of coincidence. But as I watched the city erupt, I saw a terrible intelligence in the chaos. Every coded transmission, every signal we had sent, they had read them all. The enemy wasn't guessing. They were following instructions we had written ourselves. When the bombing stopped, Brest was unrecognizable. Ships lay half-sunken in the harbor, oil fires painted the sea black, and the air stank of smoke and salt. I returned to the radio room and found the Enigma still intact, its surface dusted with ash. I touched it, but it no longer felt like metal, it felt like guilt. That night, as we transmitted Berlin's orders for counterattack, I could barely bring myself to press the keys. Each click echoed like a confession. I thought of the British pilots above, flying steady, unshaken, guided by the very signals we sent. The sea was silent now. The war had become mathematics, and the equation no longer favored us. May 1944. The forbidden words. After Brest, Fear became policy. Orders from Berlin forbade any mention of the Enigma in letters, reports, even conversation. To question is treason, they said. Every operator signed an oath of silence. The machine was now sacred, not because it worked, but because doubt itself had become the new enemy. The Gestapo began visiting our posts more often. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't need to. Their eyes were enough. They would stand in the doorway while we worked, watching in silence, as if waiting for one of us to slip. A week later, it happened. A friend of mine, Klaus, a brilliant operator, quiet and careful, made the mistake of asking a question. It was nothing, really. How do we know the codes are still safe? He said it softly, to no one in particular. But someone heard. They came for him that night. We all pretended not to hear when the boots echoed down the hall. They dragged him out of his bunk, and by morning, his name had been erased from the roster. His locker emptied, his records destroyed. It was as if he had never existed. After that, we stopped speaking altogether. The only sounds left were the clacking of the machine and the distant thunder of Allied bombs. Even laughter felt dangerous. I began to write notes to myself, fragments of thoughts I dared not speak. I hid them beneath the floorboards of the radio cabin. They know. We are feeding them. It was madness to keep them, but I needed proof that I still remembered the truth. The Enigma still worked flawlessly, its lights blinking with inhuman patience. But it no longer represented strength. It was the symbol of our imprisonment, a machine that demanded obedience and punished curiosity. When I looked at it, I no longer saw victory. I saw Klaus's empty bunk. June 1944. The betrayal of numbers. By June, the Atlantic was quiet. Too quiet. Not because we had won, but because there were fewer of us left to lose. The convoys we once hunted now crossed freely, escorted by British and American fleets that seemed to know every shadow of the sea. I kept transmitting because that was all I knew. The Enigma clicked, the lamps flashed, and I sent orders I knew were death sentences. Each time I pressed a key, I saw faces, men inside iron coffins, waiting for instructions that would lead them straight to destruction. One morning, I received a report. U-978 sunk, coordinates confirmed. Those coordinates, they were mine. I had transmitted them 2 nights earlier. My hands froze over the typewriter. I had killed them, not with a weapon, but with faith. The officers still spoke of heroic sacrifice. They called us the backbone of the Reich's intelligence. But I knew what we were, executioners of our own. The British didn't need to destroy us. We were doing it ourselves, one transmission at a time. That night, I couldn't bring myself to turn the machine on. The silence felt like mercy. But the captain noticed, his voice sharp with anger. Why isn't the signal sent? Because they already know, I answered before I could stop myself. His stare could have killed me. Then let them know, he said quietly. Berlin demands transmission. I obeyed. My fingers trembled over the keys, each letter burning into memory. The Enigma's light blinked rhythmically, efficient, emotionless, obedient. As the last signal went out into the void, I realized the truth. The numbers had betrayed us long ago. Not because they failed, but because we worshipped them more than reason, more than life itself. And somewhere across the sea, the enemy smiled, because we had done their work for them. July 1944. Voices from Bletchley. The rumors had become stories, and the stories, legend. Bletchley Park, a place none of us had seen, but all of us feared. The name passed in whispers, like a curse among the operators. They said the British had built a machine there, one that could think. That word alone was blasphemy in Germany. Machines didn't think, they obeyed. Yet ours, the mighty Enigma, had obeyed too well. The first time I heard the name Alan Turing was from a prisoner. He was young, a British radio man, captured off the coast of Brittany. They brought him aboard for interrogation, and though he was battered, his eyes held a strange calm. When one of our officers mocked him, calling him a fool to think the English could ever match our intelligence, the prisoner laughed softly. He turned his head toward me, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think your machine is the only one," he said. "Ours doesn't just encrypt. Ours learns." That was all. Hours later, he was dead, Wounds from the crash, they said. But his words burned in me like fire. Ours learns. Could that be true? Could the enemy's strength lie not in numbers or bombs, but in minds unchained by fear? That night, I listened to the static across the channels, imagining them, the codebreakers in their countryside fortress, working tirelessly while we sank deeper into the abyss. Men and women, free to question, to argue, to fail, things forbidden in our world. They weren't gods. They were thinkers. The next morning, I looked at the Enigma and saw it for what it was, a monument to arrogance. Our power came not from brilliance, but obedience. And obedience, I realized, was the slowest form of suicide. Somewhere beyond the sea, the voices of Bletchley were waiting, silent but unstoppable. They didn't need guns. They had curiosity. And curiosity, I now understood, was the sharpest weapon of all. August 1944, the fall of the gods. The ocean no longer belonged to us. By August, the proud wolf packs of the Kriegsmarine were gone, scattered wrecks beneath cold water. The few submarines that remained operated like hunted animals, surfacing only to breathe. The once glorious Atlantic campaign had become a funeral procession. We continued to receive orders from Berlin, encrypted, of course. Each one was a sermon to a congregation that no longer believed. The officers pretended otherwise, still saluting the Enigma, still muttering, "Unbreakable." But the truth had drowned with the last U-boat. One evening, a transmission arrived from High Command. I translated it with shaking hands. It read, "Continue operations. Maintain confidence. Victory is inevitable." Victory. The word felt obscene. Outside, Allied planes filled the sky, our bases were dust, our ships, ghosts. And still, they demanded faith in the machine. That night, the captain gathered us in the radio room. He looked exhausted, his face drawn, his eyes red. "The British are using our own signals to hunt us," he said quietly. "But we will not surrender. The Reich does not surrender." He turned to me. "Transmit." I stared at the Enigma, my fingers hovering above the keys. The lights flickered, as if mocking me. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to scream. But instead, I obeyed, just as I always had. The code went out, beautiful and useless, a prayer to a dead god. Outside, thunder rolled across the sea. It wasn't the weather. It was artillery, the war itself moving closer. The sound felt like judgment. The gods of the machine had fallen, and we were their last believers. September 1944, the end of the code. By September, the Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own delusion. What once seemed like an empire of precision and intellect had become a scattered ruin, broken signals, lost ships, silence where proud voices used to be. The Atlantic, once ours, was now a graveyard. The ports along the French coast had fallen one by one, and those of us who remained in the communication corps were nothing more than witnesses to a slow, methodical extinction. They came for us before dawn. The orders were simple and absolute: destroy all materials related to the Enigma. Manuals, keys, rotors, cables, codebooks, everything. No explanations, no speeches. Just the quiet efficiency of defeat. The officers walked through the corridors, collecting the relics of a faith that had died long before its followers admitted it. The courtyard behind the command post had become a pyre. The air was thick with smoke and gasoline. One by one, the machines were carried out and thrown onto the flames. Their polished steel warped and twisted in the heat, the keys melting into blackened puddles. I stood among the others, the flicker of the fire reflecting off the lenses of my glasses, and felt a strange emptiness settle inside me. For years, I had believed that the Enigma was more than a device, that it was a kind of armor against the chaos of the world. To touch it had once felt like touching destiny itself. But as I watched it burn, I realized it had never protected us. It had only hidden the truth long enough for us to destroy ourselves. Around me, men stood in silence. Some saluted as the machines burned, others turned away, unable to watch. One officer muttered that this was a tactical precaution, as if reason could soften the sound of collapse. But I could see it in their faces, the hollow eyes, the trembling hands. The war had already been lost, not on the battlefield, but in our belief that numbers and logic could replace humanity. When my turn came, I carried my machine forward. It was old, scratched, worn smooth from years of use. I placed it at the edge of the fire, but my hands refused to let go. The heat stung my skin, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't watch another piece of my life vanish into smoke. Instead, I stepped back and walked away, unnoticed amid the confusion. In my jacket, hidden beneath my shirt, I carried my codebook, the last remnant of my service, my faith, my guilt. I left the courtyard and climbed to the roof of the communications building. From there, I could see the ruins of the harbor below, the shattered ships, the rising columns of smoke, the gray waves devouring what was left of the fleet. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered, rolling closer with every hour. The sky was overcast, heavy with the smell of burning oil. I opened the codebook and flipped through its pages, strings of letters, meaningless now. I thought of the men who had died trusting these symbols, believing they were unbreakable. Each line was a name, a face, a mistake. I didn't keep the book as a souvenir. I kept it as a confession, a reminder of how faith in a machine had blinded us to the simplest truth. No system is invincible when arrogance is its foundation. The enemy had not defeated us with superior weapons, but with something far more powerful, the freedom to think, to question, to disobey. As night fell, I returned to the radio room one last time. The equipment was gone, the walls scorched. I sat in the empty chair where I had once sent hundreds of messages across the ether. For the first time, there was no hum, no static, no pulse of transmission. Just silence. I closed my eyes and listened to it, that vast, empty quiet. For years, it had terrified me. Now, it felt almost peaceful. The war was ending, and with it, the illusion that had ruled my life. The Enigma was gone. The codes were gone. All that remained was the sound of the sea, and the faint echo of a truth I had taken too long to understand. It was never the code that doomed us. It was our belief that it could never be broken. May 1945. Echoes in the silence. The war was over. At least, that's what the papers said. But for men like me, the silence that followed was not peace, it was punishment. The radios that once sang with endless orders and codes were dead now, the frequencies empty, the air still. And yet, in that void, I could still hear it, faint, steady, eternal, silence. The rhythm of the Enigma, echoing inside my skull like a ghost that refused to die. I sat alone in what was left of the communications room in Wilhelmshaven, the last outpost I had served. The walls were cracked, the paint burned by smoke. The smell of oil and dust filled the air. Around me, fragments of our pride lay scattered, broken cables, shattered lamps, the blackened shell of an Enigma machine someone had tried to destroy in the final days. I had saved one of the rotors, more out of reflex than sentiment. It sat in my palm, cold and heavy, a relic of a god that had failed us. The world outside was different now. The Allied banners hung from every building, their soldiers patrolling the streets with wary eyes. The same men we once called enemies now handed out bread to starving civilians. Children laughed in the ruins. But for those of us who had lived by the code, the laughter only made the silence deeper. Sometimes I wonder when exactly we lost the war. Not on the beaches, not in the skies, but in the quiet rooms where we placed our faith in a machine instead of in ourselves. The British didn't defeat us with superior firepower. They defeated us with thought, with the courage to question, to doubt, to disobey. I had spent years believing obedience was strength. I now knew it was weakness disguised as discipline. We had built walls of logic, equations, and encryption, and called them invincible. But behind those walls, we hid our fear of asking why. One day, as I was leaving the port, I saw a group of British officers inspecting captured equipment. Among them was a young man with sharp eyes and a quiet smile. He handled an Enigma rotor with the care of a historian touching a myth. When he saw me watching, he nodded politely. There was no hatred in his gaze, only understanding, perhaps even pity. I wanted to speak, to ask him what he knew. To ask if Bletchley Park was real, if the stories were true. But I said nothing. What answer could change what we had done? The silence between us was enough. That night, I returned to my quarters and opened the small box where I kept my last secret, the codebook I had refused to burn. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded. I traced my fingers over the lines, remembering the thousands of messages I had sent through that language of death. Somewhere, in some archive in England, they probably had them all decrypted, catalogued, understood. Our pride laid bare. I closed the book gently and placed it back inside the box. I wasn't keeping it as a souvenir of war, but as a monument to blindness. When I turned off the lamp, the darkness felt alive, humming faintly with echoes of the past. I could still hear it, the faint tap of the telegraph, the mechanical breathing of the Enigma, the whispers of men who once believed themselves gods. We thought we had built perfection. We thought the code would never break. But the truth was simpler and far crueler. No code is unbreakable when it's built on lies. Now, when I walk by an old radio or hear the distant crackle of static, the memories return, not of triumph, but of warning. I see the faces of men who believed too much, who obeyed too easily, who mistook silence for strength. And sometimes, late at night, I listen again to that old rhythm, silence. Not as a soldier, not as a believer, but as a man who finally understands. It isn't the machine I remember. It's the silence that followed it.